Hello, welcome back again. Guys, we're going to be checking a video today. This one is titled How Powerful is US Military? Wow. Can't wait to check this one out with you guys, alright? Please let me know your thoughts on this video in the comments. And if you're new here, I'm Lauren. It's a pleasure to have you. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share, subscribe so you don't miss out on more of my reactions, alright? Let's dive right in.
The US is creeping ever closer to spending $1 trillion annually on its military, with its goal being to both build and maintain the strongest fighting force the world has ever seen. And that goal may be more important now than it's been for the last 2 decades. With China rapidly modernizing its military, spending record amounts in the process, Russia showing increased aggression highlighted by its invasion of Ukraine, and turmoil in the Middle East, the US needs to be ready for anything. It needs to be strong. Which brings us to the question that we'll answer in this video. Just how powerful is the US military in 2024? To get some of our answers, we'll turn to Global Firepower, or GFP. Each year, GFP compiles rankings of 145 military nations, assigning each with what it calls a Power Index score. The goal with this score is to get as low as possible, with a Power Index of 0.0000 being considered the perfect military. GFP says the US is closer to achieving this score than any other nation, hitting a rating of 0.0699 for 2024. What does that mean in practice? We'll start with manpower. The United States has a population of just over 340 million people, according to GFP. That places it third in the world, with only China and India, both of which have populations of more than 1 billion, beating it. That population translates to 123,977,768 people who GFP claims are fit for service, with a further 4.4 million reaching military age every year. In short, the United States has millions of people who could serve as part of its military, even if they don't currently. Granted, it falls behind a couple of countries in terms of sheer manpower. However, the US is also a country that is unafraid to introduce a draft. It did so for over 30 years during the 20th century, with the draft accounting for many of its soldiers who served in World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. Of course, the draft is no longer in place. The US Armed Forces moved to a voluntary system in 1973, and it hasn't drafted a soldier since. However, in a hypothetical situation in which the US needs an army larger than the one it has now, it has over 120 million people on whom it can call, as well as a history of using drafts to bolster its numbers in times of need. But let's move away from hypotheticals for a moment. As mentioned, the US military has been voluntary for over 50 years, and it's amassed a large fighting force. GFP says there are currently 2.127 million US military personnel, of whom 1.328 million are actively serving. Again, that places the US third in the world, with only India's 1.455 million active members and China's 2.035 million surpassing it. The US bolsters these numbers with 799,500 reservists, the 10th highest stock of reserve troops in the world, though it has no paramilitary forces. These are militarized organizations, such as mercenary groups, that are often aligned with an official military's goal but work outside of its restrictions. So the US doesn't have the largest military in the world in terms of sheer manpower. However, there's an aspect of manpower that hasn't been mentioned yet: equipping soldiers. In 2021, the Military Times reported that the United States spends an average of $136,000 per active duty service member annually. That cost includes the members' wages, as well as the equipment they receive and the costs related to deploying them. Housing stipends and medical benefits are also incorporated into that figure, showcasing that the United States is among the best in the world in terms of providing its soldiers with the best possible conditions in which to train and fight. Contrast this with a nation like China or Russia. American Enterprise Institute, or AEI, reports that an entry-level soldier in China's People's Liberation Army receives just $108 per month. That's about a 16th of the $1,900
per month. Wow.
their American counterparts receive. As for Russian soldiers, reports have been flooding in from Ukraine for the past 2.5 years that Russia's soldiers are under-equipped and often forced to use outdated equipment while surviving on minimal or even out-of-date rations. Of course, there are budgetary factors at play here, which we'll explore later, but the fact remains that the US military does a better job of paying and equipping its members than many of the nations we might consider its enemies. We move to land forces. GFP's figures show that the US is something of a mixed bag in this department. For instance, it has 4,657 tanks, of which an estimated 3,493 are combat-ready, which places it fifth in the world, behind other major powers like Russia and China. It's also fifth in the world for self-propelled artillery, with 1,595, along with being 14th for towed artillery, of which it has 1,267 units. Having said all of that, the United States tops the rankings for vehicles with 360,069 available, 270,052 of which are in a combat-ready state. A powerful collection of land forces for sure, but not the best in the world in terms of sheer number of assets. However, there are caveats at play here. For instance, GFP says that Russia has about 3 times the number of tanks the United States has, with a stock of 14,777 according to its 2024 rankings. But a huge number of these tanks are Soviet-era. We've seen this in the Ukraine war, in which Russia deployed T-54 and T-55 tanks that were built in the 1940s as part of its ground invasion. The grind of that war has caused Russia to use what CBS calls mothballed tanks to fight against Ukraine's ground forces, which have destroyed at least 3,000 of Russia's stockpile since February 2022. By contrast, the United States' tank fleet is primarily comprised of the M1A1 Abrams battle tank, which began production in 1985. It's still a fairly old tank, but it's leagues ahead of the World War II and Soviet-era tanks Russia has been forced to deploy in Ukraine. There's also another factor at play, which we can again look to the Ukraine war to demonstrate. During its fight against Ukraine, Russia has failed to establish air superiority for extended periods. At best, its fighters have offered some support to ground forces before retreating behind the front lines. Far more common has been the launching of glide bombs, modified Soviet projectiles that glide thanks to wings built onto them that can be launched from Russian territory. Similarly, Russia hasn't made great use of its navy, with reports claiming that it's lost about a third of its Black Sea fleet in the fighting. What's the point? If the US went to war, it would likely not find itself in a similar position to Russia. While it would obviously need to equip its ground forces with artillery and tanks, those forces would also be supported by aerial and naval assets in joint operations. In other words, the United States doesn't need as many tanks and artillery units as other countries because it far exceeds its potential enemy's capabilities in other areas. And that brings us to America's aerial power. In sheer numbers alone, the US comes out on top in every department. GFP says America has 13,209 aircraft, of which 1,854 are fighter jets and 896 are attack-type crafts. It's top of the rankings in all 3 areas. The US also has more fixed-wing transports than any other country with 957, as well as 695 special mission craft, 5,737 helicopters, and 1,000 attack helicopters. Again, it's top in all of those categories. It's also worth mentioning America's 606 tanker aircraft, which are used to refuel planes while they're still in the sky. The United States deploys the KC-46A tanker, which its manufacturer Boeing claims is the only tanker to meet the stringent requirements created by both the Federal Aviation Administration and the US Air Force. It's capable of carrying 212,000 pounds of fuel, allowing it to refuel practically any other aircraft. And it's interoperable, meaning that it can refuel not only American aircraft, but the craft used by many of its allies. Why do these tankers matter? In a word, range. With the capability to refuel in the sky comes the ability to keep planes in the air for longer. We can look to the Indo-Pacific for an example of why this is important. Over the last several years, China has been building man-made islands in the South China Sea, which it is militarizing and will likely use as refueling points for its planes should war break out in the region. Such a war would likely involve Taiwan, with the odds being high that the US would arrive to defend the island. The US Navy would likely send aircraft carriers, with the US also making use of its bases in Japan, South Korea, and Australia in the fighting. The key here is that China's aircraft would have to make regular stops, either in the Chinese mainland or on one of the man-made islands in the South China Sea to refuel. That's not the case for US aircraft. They could refuel in the sky as needed thanks to America's tanker fleet, allowing them to penetrate deeper into enemy territory while outlasting their Chinese equivalents in direct battles. The US military knows this, and it understands that its potential enemies don't have the same refueling capabilities. After all, China only has 10 tankers, with Russia being slightly better with 19. Both are massively behind America's capabilities here, with aerial refueling likely being a key weapon in any conflict between the US and these two countries. It's also worth noting that America's aerial fleet isn't solely concentrated in the US Air Force. As World Population Review notes, the US Air Force has around 5,200 craft. That's followed by the US Army, which has about 4,400, and the US Navy with approximately 2,450 aircraft. Russia's entire air force numbers 3,863 assets, according to the same resource, meaning the US essentially has military branches, the US Air Force and US Army, that have more aircraft than Russia's entire military. Each of those branches uses its aircraft for different purposes, as well as being capable of coordinating with one another as needed. That's another key strength, as we'll discuss later. Sticking with aerial power, there's also the equipment factor that comes into play. At a time when China is heavily pushing the Chengdu J-20 as its answer to the F-35, the United States is already looking to the future. Disregarding the direct comparisons between the J-20 and the F-35 for a moment, China's plane seems faster, but the F-35 is stealthier. The fact that China is still working on bringing the J-20 into active deployment shows it's playing catch-up. As for the US military, it initiated its Next Generation Air Dominance Program, or NGAD, in 2014 and has already spent $11.7 billion on research and development. Not only will NGAD lead to the creation of a sixth-generation fighter, with the planned service entry being in 2030, but it will also mark a wholesale shift in aerial operations. Solo fighters will be out. They'll be replaced by a network of aircraft, with the fighter being deployed as the centerpiece that a pilot can deploy to strike targets. Along with the jet the pilot flies, they'll be able to control a small fleet of unmanned aircraft with strike capabilities. In other words, the US is working on bringing drones into a systems-based aerial strategy, while countries like China and Russia are still trying to catch up to the country's fifth-generation fighters. Next up, the US Navy. Based on the sheer numbers alone, it seems like the US doesn't quite top GFP's rankings in terms of sheer number of assets. It has 472 vessels, which is a long way behind the 730 of China, which has the second largest navy, and Russia, which has 781 assets. However, the United States comes out on top in many of the areas that matter. It has more aircraft carriers than any other country with 11, once again highlighting the joint operations approach it takes to warfare. It has 9 helicopter carriers and 75 destroyer warships, topping the rankings in both of those categories too. The country's 64 submarines place it second in that department, and it also has the 4th most corvettes at 23. Where the US falls is in its number of frigates. It has none in its navy, as well as its lack of patrol vessels. But therein lies the secret to America's naval power. It's not trying to build the largest navy in terms of assets. Instead, it's focused on water displacement. This is the measure of the amount of water a ship displaces, with larger ships obviously displacing more water. And when it comes to this metric, the US is a long way ahead. According to a 2021 Forbes article, the US Navy displaces around 4.5 million tons of water, with China, supposedly the owner of the second largest navy in the world, lagging at 2 million tons. This matters not only because it means the US has the larger ships, but for what those ships bring to the table. More size equates to more weapons on board, as well as the ability to absorb more damage before sinking. The US also accounts for its role as a global protector here, with many of its ships being as large as they are, because they're tasked with sailing thousands of miles from their home ports in San Diego, Hawaii, and Washington. Larger ships can carry more fuel, with the logistical and weapons-based benefits they offer being the icing on the naval cake. The displacement is growing too. That's according to Chuck Hill's CG blog. A former Coast Guard officer, Hill was assigned to 4 different ships during his career and was the first Coast Guard officer to complete the Tactical Action Officer course in August 1980. Now he describes himself as an old guy and a grandfather, though he uses his blog to analyze the state of the US Navy regularly. He says that the US Navy decommissioned several vessels in 2023, including 4 cruisers, 4 littoral combat ships, or LCSs, 5 patrol vessels, and a pair of nuclear-powered attack submarines, or SSNs. However, that decommissioning was balanced by the US introducing a trio of new destroyers, 5 new LCS, a new SSN, and a replenishment ship. All told, it added 55,658 tons to its total displacement. While that was behind Russia and China, who added 211,333 and 93,567 tons respectively, it still shows that the US Navy's displacement is growing, so it stays ahead of the rest of the world. In simple terms, the US Navy may not have the most ships, but it has the largest and most powerful. It also has the most versatile navy, thanks to its aircraft and helicopter carriers. When combined, Russia and China only have 4 of these carriers, about a third of what the US has, with America's focus on these larger ships being emblematic of the combined approach it takes to naval warfare. If a country has to fight the US at sea, it not only has to face massive ships, but also the many fighters and helicopters that can launch from those ships. And even if the opponent can bring its own air force into the fight, the US still has an advantage thanks to its tankers offering its aircraft more range. And that's without even mentioning the US Marine Corps, which has 174,557 active duty members, along with 39,599 reserves as of the end of 2023. The Marines are the US Navy's Land Force Service Branch and are responsible for both amphibious and expeditionary operations, as well as being some of the fastest responders to developing crises. In other words, the US Navy is far from being just a collection of ships. It combines having what essentially amounts to its own air force with one of the most well-trained land forces on the planet to be a formidable foe.
Wow.
So the US military is in a very strong position. It's third in sheer manpower, rules the roost when it comes to its air force, and likely has the strongest navy on the planet. Plus, it's well drilled in joint operations, with each of its major branches having elements of the others, such as the US Army and US Navy each having aerial assets that showcase America's approach to joint warfare and operations. However, there's an aspect of US military strength that often goes underestimated, but may actually be the key to its achieving victory: logistics. Starting with assets, so much of what the US military maintains is designed to help it set up its bases and keep them supplied as quickly as possible. It has 957 fixed-wing transports, because those planes can get troops and equipment on the ground practically anywhere, while giving the US more options beyond coastal invasions. That's not to say it neglects naval transport. The US has 14 Expeditionary Fast Transports, or TEPFs, which are shallow draft ships capable of transporting troops and equipment into or out of locations as needed. Each has a flight deck that can land a CH-53 helicopter, as well as a stern ramp for vehicle access and enough room to seat 312 passengers. And its ability to hit an average speed of 35 knots makes it one of the fastest naval transports around. Add all of this to 360,000 vehicles the US military maintains, and you get a fighting force that's extremely capable of moving people and equipment around the world as needed. But that's not all. The US maintains its logistical advantage by building and maintaining military bases all over the world. According to Al Jazeera, the United States maintains around 750 overseas bases spread across at least 80 countries. These bases range from small lily pads, which are smaller than 10 acres and have a total value of $10 million or less. Lily pads account for 40% of the 750 bases, with their main goals usually being to enhance cooperative security and give the US access to forward operating sites from which it can launch missions. The other 60% are large bases, which usually host at least 200 US military personnel, along with equipment these soldiers can use as and when needed. Through these bases, the US achieves almost global coverage. For instance, it has 120 bases in Japan, housing over 53,000 troops, along with 73 bases in South Korea and 7 in Australia, that collectively contain around 27,500 troops. That gives the US vital coverage in the Indo-Pacific, with the personnel at those bases likely being the first to respond to Chinese military activity. As for the Middle East, the US has 10 bases in Kuwait, another 10 in Saudi Arabia, and around 2,500 troops stationed in Iraq. Again, the purpose is the same: ensuring that it can deploy troops anywhere, while having bases set up to keep both those troops and any that arrive later supplied during military operations. These bases are also part of America's collective defense approach to its military, which brings us to NATO and the various military partnerships the US has. As a NATO member, the US is supported by another 31 countries, most based in Europe, that are obligated to come to its defense should an attack occur on American soil. That's due to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all of them. Through that membership, the US has the opportunity to bolster its ranks with help from countries like the United Kingdom, which is global firepower's 6th-ranked military, and the 11th-placed France. America's NATO partnerships also make it easier for the country to set up military bases in Europe, ideal for reacting to an ever more aggressive Russia should the time call for it. US cooperation goes more granular than its membership in this large defense network. It also sets up partnerships that see it collaborate with other countries on coordinating defensive strategy and running military drills. The trilateral cooperation pact it has with Japan and South Korea is a good example. All three have committed to working together within the Indo-Pacific to make the world safer and the three countries stronger, according to the Department of Defense. Of course, reading between the lines, it's clear the partnership exists primarily so that the US can keep an eye on China. Similarly, the US has another three-country agreement involving Australia and the United Kingdom, often called AUKUS. This agreement was signed in September 2021 and is focused on helping to provide Australia with a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines by the 2040s. The US obviously benefits from getting yet another partner in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as from strengthening its relationship with the United Kingdom. The point here is that when determining US military strength, you can't simply look at the US alone. Yes, it already has one of the world's strongest militaries, but it bolsters that strength
This
by
is
allying
great.
itself with as many countries as possible. That focus on alliances is why it has so many overseas bases, which strengthen its logistical
Yeah.
operations, allowing it to closely surveil other countries and provide it with launching points for operations. Being a member of NATO means the US benefits from and contributes to an organization that creates deterrence
Oh my
through
God.
collective defense. If the US is invaded, it can trigger Article 5
This
and have
totally
31
makes
countries ready to
the
come to its
US
defense.
totally
Then there are the small
untouchable.
defensive pacts
Oh.
it's signed with other countries. All give it
This
more
is
eyes and
great.
ears
I
around the world,
really
while
like
allowing the
this.
US to
This is
strengthen its
amazing.
military with the support of others. So where does this leave the United States in terms of its military? While there's no denying that the US is strong, perhaps even as strong as it's
Yeah.
ever been during the voluntary military era,
You
there
don't
are a
wanna
handful
try
of
that.
issues that could diminish its strength. Key among those is budget. You may remember earlier in the video that we mentioned the US defense budget of $841.4 billion. We also touched on how much more the US spends on the average soldier than China. Both of these things are beneficial to the US when it comes to building its military strength, though there's also a hidden issue with that budget that could compromise the country. It's not getting as much for its money as many of its potential enemies. Take China as an example. In 2024, China announced it would increase its defense budget by 7.2%, meaning it will reach $231.6 billion and keep the country in second place in terms of global military spenders. On the surface, that should mean that China isn't able to strengthen as much as the US in 2024. However, AEI notes that China is likely spending far less on equipment than the United States. That's if China's economy is measured using purchasing power parity, or PPP. The International Monetary Fund says this is the rate at which the currency of one country would have to be converted into that of another country to buy the same amount of
Oh.
goods and services in each country. In practice, accounting for PPP means that China can spend less on its soldiers not because it's skimping out on equipping them, but because the equipment it provides simply costs less than equivalent equipment in the United States. In short,
I mean,
China gets
one
more
tree
bang
doesn't
for its
make a
military
forest
buck.
after all.
The fact that the United States buys all of its military equipment from private companies plays into this. While many may joke that the US will always go to the lowest bidder, that doesn't change the fact that the US
Yeah.
military doesn't directly control the manufacturing of the equipment it uses. So its budget has to rise to reflect the prices its private contractors demand, a potential issue when countries like China and Russia have state-owned military manufacturing. The US military also has another problem to confront: recruitment. For as large as the US military is, the number of active duty members has declined over the last 3 decades. USA facts say that manpower is down by 39% from the levels it was at in 1987. While this is partially due to the US trimming where needed and becoming more efficient, it's also indicative of a recruitment issue that could threaten the voluntary nature of the country's armed forces in the future. The US recognizes this problem. In December 2023, the Department of Defense published an article in which Army Major General Johnny K. Davis, who is the commanding general of the Army Recruiting Command, claimed that the recruiting landscape is one of the toughest he's seen in more than 33 years. He notes that the percentage of American youngsters who could even qualify to serve in the military has declined. Couple that with a strong economy leading to low unemployment and less chance to recruit those who simply need a job, and you have a key challenge the US must confront. It's attempting to do so. In 2024, the US military has set itself a target of recruiting 55,000 active duty soldiers, along with a further 60,000 for its reserves. That target may be out of reach, however. After all, as Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Walter Pincus revealed in a May 2024 article published in the Cipher Brief, the US failed to meet its recruitment targets in 2023. It was the first time that had happened in 24 years. The US military is shrinking. Whether the top brass manages to reverse that trend is yet to be seen. So there are issues that the US needs to figure out in terms of how it manages its budget and how it recruits people to its various branches. However, that doesn't change the fact that the country still has the world's most powerful military. Global firepower certainly seems to think so, noting that the US has a dominating air force and is near the top of the pile when it comes to manpower, even with its recruiting issues. Its navy, though not the largest in terms of assets, displaces the most amount of water, and it has alliances with dozens of other countries that have allowed the US to build bases all over the world. The last point is crucial. It allows the US to maintain an unrivaled logistical network that ensures its soldiers are well stocked and capable of fighting anywhere. But now we want to hear your opinions. Is there any aspect of America's military strength that we've missed or that you believe should be covered? Will the US be able to maintain the strength it has in 2024 to the point where it remains the country with the strongest military? Or will the likes of China or Russia manage to catch up in the coming years? Tell us what you think below, and thank you for watching the video.
Wow. Wow, guys, that was really incredible. But then there's this part of the US, is it the Armed Forces or the Navy? I think the Armed Forces or the Air Force. No, US Air Force that I didn't get. All right. And that is the US B-2 stealth bomber. The US B-2 stealth bomber, like the B-2 Spirit. I didn't see it in any part of the video, or is it not important? I know I've seen the reaction, the attack on the hoodie, human hoodie attack, and that has happened a couple of weeks ago. So I was really expecting to see that, like to see it in full story. So I was really disappointed not to find it. Please let me know more about it in the comments, all right? Let me know because I want to know more about it. I love it, all right, guys? Let me know your thoughts on this video in the comments. And wow, that is great. Like it was really mind blowing, all right? Let me know your thoughts on this video in the comments, and I'll see you again in the next one. If you have a recommendation that you would want me to check out, don't hesitate to put it right there in the comments, alright? I'll see you in the next video. I remain your girl, Lauren. Bye.